Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Josh Hirsch, for those of you who don't know me. I am a senior editor at the Columbia Journalism Review, and I'm the host of our podcast, The Kicker, which we are also taping an episode of right now, which is very exciting. I was also previously a correspondent for Vice News, and I spent a number of years living and reporting in the Middle East. And I would say probably a lot of people were inspired to move to the Middle East by the writing of Ghaith Abdul-Ahad. I might be the only person who was literally badgered into it by him, because at some point we were together, we were in Istanbul, and I was a young person vacillating, agonizing over whether I should move from New York to Beirut or not, and coming up with all of these excuses not to do it. And Ghaith turned to me one day and said, "In April, I'm going to be in Afghanistan. You can stay in my apartment. No problem." And suddenly I had no more excuses, and so I had to do it. And so my mother, I think, is still a little angry at you for this, but I am grateful. So thank you so much, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's obviously a lot we can talk about, and I hope to cover a lot of parts of your career in this conversation, including your beautiful book, A Stranger in Your Own City, about the war in Iraq and your life there. But I wondered if we could start with a subject that you've written about more recently, something that's very dear to me too, which is the war in Syria. One of your most recent articles for The Guardian was about a young man who you called Mustafa, who you described as a reluctant collaborator with the Syrian regime. And the story you told about him struck me in a way as a really classic example of a Ghaith story, because it was a story of a human being, frankly, ordinary human being, who found himself caught up in a war and ended up, to some extent on the wrong side, fighting for the wrong side. And yet the piece you wrote resists the temptation to moralize and to categorize him. It's about who he is as a human and how this happens to people. Could you talk a little bit about his story and what drew you to him?
So first, thank you so much for this. In a room, half of it is my heroes. And look, when I started journalism in Iraq, I was a military deserter. So I started looking at things with this high morality. Look, I did never compromise. I never joined the regime. None of my family joined the regime. So all of you who have compromised are beneath me. And that was my attitude for the first 6 months in 2003. And little by little, I was smacked in the head and realized how difficult life is. So in the past 20 years, you realize all of us have to make these little choices. And at the end of the day, we're all trying to save ourselves, save our families. And what choices do we make to reach that point? So Mustafa was one of those people. Mustafa had to survive a regime, a brutal regime. Mustafa comes from, if we put this kind of sectarian ethnic map, he would be labeled within the opposition masses of Damascus, living in a small neighborhood. These neighborhoods were the hotbed of the rebels in the outskirts of Damascus. And his father is a religious man. His sister wears the burqa. So he is a suspect in the eye of the regime. Now, how do you come out of this? Because also when we look at the war, we think of it as a regime versus rebels. But in reality, the neighborhoods split. You have the old gangs become working for the government, then other gangs working for the rebels. And within all that kind of landscape, here's a certain person who was beaten up so harsh when he was 16, 17. He decides, you know what? My rule number one, I will never be beaten up ever again.
Right.
And of course, he gets beaten up again and again and again. And so these are the choices that he makes. And
he wasn't an ideologue, right? He was, where he ended up and where he began were not exactly in the same.
Absolutely. This is the problem. I mean, sitting in this room and we can easily say, oh, he compromised, he joined the regime militia. But from his perspective is, how do I save myself? And of course he doesn't.
I was you brought it up, and I was thinking about whether to ask you this, but I wondered if you see yourself in people like him sometimes as someone who also got pulled into these conflicts and then not turned into a soldier, of course, but I mean, maybe worse, a journalist, but pulled into things you never expected to be pulled into.
I mean, of course, it's the worst situation to stand in front of a checkpoint, and how do you save yourself? That is these are the choices that we all make as journalists. We pass through checkpoints, we get detained. Sometimes we save ourselves, sometimes not. Sometimes we enjoy the hospitality of the gunmen. And
There was a line in that piece that caught my eye. You're late in the piece, you're describing the scene in Damascus in the aftermath of the fall of Assad. And you almost, I think, instinctually compare it to the aftermath of Baghdad and the fall of Saddam. And I wonder what that experience was like for you to be there in that moment and those contrasts. And if you're able to see hope and joy in this, or does your brain just flash back through the last however many years and think, oh, I know where these things end up?
the biggest challenge for me as an Iraqi when it comes to Syria is to stop being an Iraqi. Because I lived through the moments when the regime in Baghdad fell. I saw the aftermath of the Taliban falling in Afghanistan. But the Iraq experience shaped my life. You know, I was a civilian, then I became a journalist when the statue fell. And a lot of what happened also became my daily life as a journalist. So when you go to Syria, you see the resemblance. You see a Ba'athist regime, a dictator falling, the army melting away, the uniforms in the streets, the tanks abandoned in the street. All scenes from Baghdad 2003.
Yeah.
And yet it is so very different. It is different because there is no foreign army, apart from a little bit of Uyghurs and Uzbeks, but they are brothers.
But not nearly in the same way, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't find in foreign occupation. Also, you know, in Iraq, the moment of 2003 was the moment when we Iraqis realized, oh God, we are Sunnis and Shia and Kurds, and we started fragmenting along these lines. In Syria, it is the aftermath of a civil war. So it's been going on for 14 years. You have the sense that people are tired from war, while in Iraq was beginning. Another point, which as a person who loves to walk in the city and doodle and take pictures, Damascus is so fascinating as a city for a former architect. And you see people kind of happy that you're walking in their streets, appreciating their buildings, and come inside, look at
Right.
And that sense of relief is amazing. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So you found you were able to embrace that in the
Yes,
moment.
absolutely. And also there is these moments when one regime has fallen and the other hasn't established itself yet. So this time in between, when the old mukhabarat had melted away, the new mukhabarat is not strong enough to stop you. And that's always the perfect time to work, I think, for me, be it in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in Syria.
But there are also these little warning signs, because Mustafa, he finds himself detained in a prison that he sought to avoid from his previous times as a deserter, right? Which of course reminded me of you also ending up in a very similar situation by the Americans, and shortly after they arrived,
Yes.
where you were detained by them in a very prison that you had sought to avoid for many, many years.
Yes, I mean, look, Mustafa was detained in a prison, a former regime prison, beaten up and put in a cell. I was also talking recently to a opposition activist, a journalist, who went into a demonstration and the new police or whatever detained him, beat him up and something. And he was telling me something which is very interesting. It's those young kids, you know, they grew up in war, 15 years, 18 years of war. They know nothing. Where would they bring the way to deal with a detainee without beating and something? So that's the legacy, the trauma of violence that kind of is the biggest problem in this region, I think.
Yeah, it's an organic reason why these cycles perpetuate themselves. Can we go back to the beginning, to your book and how you ended up as a journalist? Your book begins with actually a really useful prehistory of Iraq prior to the Americans arriving. But I think for our purposes, you are, at the time of the invasion, you are an architect, designing what I think you describe as ugly homes for ugly people, pretty bored, finding scraps of paper to borrow to do your drawings on. but also clearly interested in people, interested in the city, observant already, but not imagining being a journalist, I don't think. How did that happen? Are you surprised that you did this?
I mean, you don't know what journalism is because growing up in Iraq under the Saddam regime, journalism is this newspaper you read in the morning that starts with the speeches of the leader and ends with the wisdom of the leader. So journalism was, a government job like the intelligence service, like anything. So a despised job in Iraq. I didn't know what journalism is. I met amazing people like John Lee and others in Baghdad in these days who were an inspiration, of course. But the fact that the biggest army in the universe invades your street and you come down and you look at these American Marine kind of amphibious vehicles as if the shores of Normandy is down the street. And that becomes a fascinating moment, and you see the statue falling,
right.
and you want
and you describe watching it, thinking, "Oh, don't do it this way." Right? Some part of your brain is already registering. Let the people bring this down. Don't right?
I mean, this moment when they put the American flag on this whole idea of liberation collapses within this 5 minutes of pulling down the statue. But then you go, I wanted to see Saddam's palace.
Yeah.
This is the person who has dominated my life since I was born. Who is he? How did he lead us? Why did he do these things? I thought, like, if I walk into the palace, I would just find the answers. Of course I didn't. But then I met James Meek from The Guardian, and the rest is history, and I became a journalist.
And so in the beginning you were working as a translator,
as a translator, as a fixer, but also, and this is a secret. Don't tell The Guardian this. But imagine you're traveling through your own country, a country that you couldn't travel through because I was a military deserter, I didn't have ID card, and someone's paying you money. Someone's paying money to travel through the country, to talk to people, to find people.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating for me.
Yeah.
The only thing I had is I spoke the language, and the rest, I didn't know anything about Iraq, just like everyone else, because it was such a closed society. Then you start exploring. But that period of exploration collapsed very quickly because then we ended into this whole sectarian dynamic. And
you called your book A Stranger in Your Own City, which I think refers to this later phase when the city changes in ways that you can't possibly recognize. But even before then, you were in some ways a stranger in your own country.
We're all strangers in our countries,
sure.
in one way or another.
I covered gun lovers and Trump in 2017 in Iowa, and I didn't know anything about it. So.
Exactly, but I couldn't leave Baghdad. I would have loved to travel, to go to Beirut and other places, but I was a 29-year-old who have never left Iraq, let alone Baghdad. I've been to Mosul, to Basra a couple of times. Baghdad is my city. I know it by heart, and that is your own city. And then within 1 year and a half of the war, you realize you can't go to that neighborhood without someone there vouching for you. You can't go to the east of Baghdad without dressing up in black as a Shia. You can't go to the Sunni parts of the city because the fragmentation, which starts in our heads, takes a physical form on the ground, and the city starts fragmenting. And then here is my city. 2 years after, I'm living in a hotel room. Yeah. I can't live in a house, and I can't go visit the city as a normal Iraqi.
Yeah.
And this is when, in Arabic, we call it كغريب في مدينتك, as a stranger in your own city, and that is how you feel.
Yeah. I remember watching you, maybe one of the first things I ever saw you do, possibly before I met you, doing, I think it was Frontline, a video package about the walls that the Americans had erected across the city, and how it had cut right through neighborhoods that you had grown up in and neighborhoods where you'd gone to school, and it had made the entire landscape of your life unrecognizable to you.
So I don't want to say that this kind of, we didn't have sects in Iraq. Of course we had sects. Of course there were Sunnis and Shia and the Christians, mashallah, they had their own 12 sects in Iraq. But it was a cultural thing. It was always something that you celebrate, you go to this mosque in this time of the year, the church in this other time of the year. It was a cultural phenomenon. But the invasion itself weaponized these differences. When you divide the society into oppressed and the oppressor, you push a whole segment of the Iraqi. Because Saddam was a Sunni, then all Sunnis are, by association, are guilty of oppressing the Iraqis. This is a recipe for civil war. And then...
And you speak to a lot of Sunnis who describe not having wanted to be part of an insurgency, certainly, or an armed opposition, but just feeling so demoralized and dehumanized by this characterization of themselves.
Because when people start getting kidnapped and killed because they are Sunnis, and Shia are being killed in a mosque because they are Shia, the next thing is you have the armed... Who carries weapons? Will you carry a weapon? No. Will any of us carry a weapon? No. It's the people who love to carry weapons, the thugs in the streets, who are the first people who will, and I don't say it in a negative way, it's the people who will carry weapons to defend their neighborhoods, are the people who, the toughs of a neighborhood. And those people will fragment, and then they start building barricades, start building walls, and that's how the cities start fragmenting. Then the Sunnis will move from one neighborhood to another, then the Shia will move from one neighborhood into another.
Yeah.
And then the next stage is a war.
Well, that sectarianism became very real, and of course we're now living with it. It is undeniable. But I did find it interesting in your book that you seem to be as mystified by it as anyone, and not just mystified by the arrival of sectarianism. I mean, certainly this importing of it as if it's this American product, like a bunch of Apple computers that have shown up, but also that I think the sense I got is that you had to unlearn in the course of reporting this book and reporting these stories. You realized that some of these things you'd internalized were not things that had always been there in the society.
I mean, to start work as a translator, you adapt and adopt a way of thinking. So when the journalists you're working with, God bless the New York Times, I was working with them for a while, when they start asking me to find me a Sunni or find me a Shia because we want to do this kind of story or that kind of stuff, you start categorizing people as Sunnis and Shia. Yeah. I started putting numbers on my old Nokia phone. So-and-so is a Sunni, so-and-so is a Shia. And it took me more than 5 years to start trying to unlearn this, to try to find the people who find themselves on the wrong side of on the wall. And this is when it comes 20 years later to find Mustafa. In the sectarian definition, Mustafa should be in the opposition. But in reality, Mustafa works for the regime. And so all these kind of people who defy this sectarian narrative of them.
I wonder if it's that awareness, that self-awareness that helps you. I mean, some of it is that you're closer to the culture and closer to the land. And so a Western journalist arriving is going to naturally form certain categorization that you may not be prone to in the same way. But I wonder if it's some of that self-awareness that's made it more possible for you to interview a group of jihadis and set aside a paragraph to talk about this person's childhood in a way that you just wouldn't see, not never, but you wouldn't see as commonly in these and other stories.
So two things here. I mean, to be fair to the journalists, Iraq was a closed society. All the press or all the literature that was coming out of Iraq was coming out of, a group of people who were living outside Iraq. See Kanaan Makia in London and they were very hard in pushing a sectarian narrative to topple the regime. But it's basically borrowing the kind of the Balkan War and implementing it on Iraq.
Right.
So that already was seeping into the society.
And it had the imprimatur of the Iraqis who were saying, this is the way this society is built. So,
exactly. And yeah. Saddam was guilty of bombing the Kurds and killing the Kurds and committing massacres in the south, which was predominantly Shia area. So that narrative was already there, and it was weaponized after the fall of Baghdad. One thing, before going to the jihadis, I think this trauma, the thing of sectarianism that emerged in Iraq in 2003, traveled to Syria, from Syria went to Yemen. Yemen, a country I used to visit, had no sectarian, had the tribal divisions, had whatever city versus the mountains, the desert. But suddenly after 2014, again, sectarian narrative became the dominant factor when Arabic TV channels talk about Shia militias and the Zaydis are not Shia versus Sunni tribes. So again, and then that sectarianism came back in Iraq with ISIS to reach its peak. So yes, so talking to the jihadis, again, you realize that in the end of the day, he is just a small, young bus driver from Sana'a, driven by this passion to go fight the infidels in Iraq, and along with thousands of other people. And again, they become another kind of weapon to be used in this conflict.
I'm stuck on this because I find it really profound. I think it's a hard thing for the West to recognize, because we like to, even now we have stories right now about the US and Israel versus Iran, as if these are just these conglomerates that are simplified in conflict with one another. But throughout your work, you've always identified the extremely local nature, the extremely individualized nature of conflict. I mean, even when ISIS comes to Mosul, you have these tribes who are choosing sides on the basis of personal grievances, and it's so divorced from the geopolitics, which is how we so often look at this.
You know, Josh, at one point, I think in 2007 or 8, when I realized that the sectarian commanders in Baghdad are basically, you know, it's good to kill someone and steal their cars and houses, and you have a religious justification for. This is when I realized there is no one conflict crossing the region from Tehran to Sana'a via Baghdad and Damascus, but a constellation of smaller conflicts utilized for a bigger one. I mean, we see it in Syria. We see people coming from Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran fighting versus people coming from Uzbekistan, China, Belgium, all on the ground. And that is, again, utilizing a small conflict and turning it into a global conflict. So up until today, I still think we don't have a Sunni-Shia war, but we have wars that, for different local reasons, utilized for different local reasons, and packaged and given as one. It's easier. Wallah, it's so much easier to understand the conflict in the Middle East as Iran versus the Sunnis, or the jihadis versus the Israel. But if we see it as a local conflict, I think it's much more difficult, but it's much more interesting.
Yeah, much less interesting to maybe Pentagon policymakers and talking heads in Washington, but much more accurate.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, there's another motif in your book, which I was frankly very grateful to see you didn't really hold back on, which is that the Americans are fucking idiots. This is a recurring theme. You don't put it quite that bluntly, but you do come away with a sense of the buffoonery of the American project. I had completely forgotten that there were, I mean, forgotten is the wrong word because I was in college and barely paying attention, but that there were executioners chanting Muqtada's name when Saddam was executed. I mean, the lack of awareness of what the Americans were doing along the way in those days. Do you think that there is an understanding today? This is such a dumb question, so forgive me to everyone. But do you think that Americans understand what they did to Iraq?
So the first time I went to New York was, I think, 2005, and I was staying in a very nice apartment, lovely city, beautiful. And I switched on the TV, and I thought, 2 years into the Iraq war, I thought people would burn American tanks in the streets, Humvees, soldiers dying, massacres committed. I thought like the coverage will be 24 hours about the Iraq war. Nothing. The only item about Iraq was how a band was, visiting Iraq or something. And that is like,
This may have been Vice, actually, early days of Vice.
so it kind of shocked me about how little, and up until today, I don't know why. If I was an American conservative neocon, I believe America first. Why would America invade Iraq? It's a really, I don't know why they invaded Iraq, why they spent so much money to invade a country, to lose so much money on that country, and then turn that country into the biggest ally of their opponent in the region, which is Iran. So it's not only kind of politically, from an American conservative, whatever point of view, it was a very dumb project, let alone the disaster it unleashed in the region. Now, I'm not saying Saddam was evil, but also I find these binary choices. Every taxi in the Middle East, you're Iraqi, yes. So, which was better, Saddam or the Americans? As if we Iraqis don't have a choice, It's only a mad dictator or illegal occupation, and that is the problem. So my anger with Americans is not only destroying Iraq, not only committing massacres and whatnot, and so, not a single person went to jail for the things they did in Iraq. Not George Bush, not Nour al-Maliki. No one has ever stood and said, well, I'm sorry for the things we've done.
Yeah, not just not going to jail. That seems like way too high a standard, but maybe contrition. Maybe a sense that we need to rethink our entire ideological structure here that led us down this road.
The problem with Iraq today, 20 years after the war, is all the people who have committed massacres, all the people who killed, all the people who weaponized sectarianism for all, are still there, are still ruling, enjoying the benefits of the new rule, sitting in the parliament, having militias, or becoming, I don't know, ski trainers in a resort somewhere. Those are war criminals in the definition of a war crime. So without that moment of standing up and saying, this is the things we have done, we will never have a proper reconciliation, because the same trauma of violence and sectarianism will be repackaged and will travel to Syria, to Yemen, and come back to haunt this region. And that's my problem. And this is why I'm angry.
Well, I think it's legitimate. I'm going to open up to some people, but there's one other question that I've always wanted to ask you. So I'm going to ask it now. It's about the craft, though. It's about your approach to the work.
Are you Sunni or Shia?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Anyone who's known you over these years has known you during some time when you were in danger, detained or kidnapped or nearly blown up or something. And yet, when you read your work, when you read your book, and I think this may be somewhat just a byproduct of your personality, but I couldn't help notice how much of that danger you put in the background of the story. You describe your detention in Libya in a single sentence at one point, just in passing. And I wonder if maybe it's a personal detachment from that risk, but you also describe being very fearful at times. So I wonder if it's a storytelling approach to sort of decenter yourself, or how do you think about how you engage with that?
Well, I'm scared all the time, not sometimes. But also, I think it's not about me. It's not about. I mean, no one put a gun on my head and said, "Take that risk." I took that risk. Sometimes stupidly, sometimes I didn't have a choice. But it's my risk. It's not the guilt of the reader to kind of go through my flagellation and self. But also, I think I want to tell the story of Mustafa, of the other people on the ground. I don't want to be distracted by my own reading War and Peace in a Taliban detention cell. So that's what I think is. But also, when you're a child, you believe that a journalist child, you believe the more risk you take, the more reward you get. Which is an absurd way of looking at it. And there is no byline for risk, oh, I took this risk, get a byline. And then that becomes a byproduct. And a byproduct, I personally don't think it's worth reading.
Do you find that you have to kind of redirect young journalists who look at you and think, oh, you're so brave, I want to be like that?
I think if we talk about how much scared we are when we do our job, that's the ultimate thing. There is no bravado in this profession, and you see so many friends lost and killed and along the way. So,
There is one moment in the book where you volunteer. You suggest that you want to see what it's like inside of the detention centers, and you volunteer to get yourself arrested so you can see them. And your friend, who would be able to arrange it, very wisely tells you that this is a terrible idea because you would have to be tortured, even if you were there voluntarily.
He says, I will take your money, I will take you to jail, I will detain you, but I can't get you out. But I have to say something. When I was in Syria recently, I visited one of the many detention centers of this brutal, horrific regime. And I went into one of the cells because I wanted to re-feel So I was, I spent some time in the cell, but anyhow. So I go to the cell and I close the door, and it's very dark and very tiny solitary confinement cell. And I panic within seconds, and I open the door and I come out. And then I'm talking to one of the detainees. I said, how could you live there? And he says, we were 13 people inside that cell. So this is the level of horror that a person lives through that we journalists see a fraction of, if we do.
I'm glad you didn't do that, though. I think that would have been one of your worst ideas. Maybe not your actual worst idea, but one of your worst ideas. I'd love to give an opportunity if anyone has a question here.
Hi, Ghaith. Feel very inspired to sit and listen to you. My name's George Butler. I'm also an illustrator, so this is a loaded question. But I was so struck by the thoughtfulness and some of the gentleness that when you describe the stories. And I wondered well, you describe it as doodling, but I think we would all describe it as art. I wondered what that contributes to some of the stories. Do you see it differently through an artist's eyes?
So for those who are listening, George is one of Allah's greatest illustrators, and unlike the rest of us, he sits with his brush in the middle of a conflict and draws, talking about. So George, I mean, once an architect is always an architect. So part of me understands cities. I love cities, and I love the architecture of the city. And you realize how certain cities, certain architecture of a city, leads to a conflict in a different way. So in Aleppo, the tight buildings create a certain kind of conflict, a certain kind of war. The colors, the lights changes. In Yemen, it's a different kind of conflict. So yes, of course, I look at the scene and I'm thinking, how would I draw that scene? And then you end up writing. And I always think there are two kinds of stories. Stories that you can illustrate, photography, drawings, or whatever. And these are easily written stories because the images are in your head. And stories in which you don't have an image for, and these are the worst kind of stories to write. And it's like, ugh.
Thank you so much for the interesting talk and discussion. I'm Maya. I'm from Georgia. In my previous life, I was reporting on international news from here, but now I'm working for UNICEF. You were talking about weaponizing differences, and here also the Russians are so much using the same actually strategy of weaponizing differences, and here in Georgia and instigating the conflicts and polarizing societies, which we're witnessing today. But also I would say that there's one more weapon that is weaponized so well everywhere, and especially here. This is a disinformation, right, which is spreading all over. I wonder what is the role now of journalists in this polarized and in this kind of a disinformation saturated environment to address these challenges. Thank you.
Well, I mean, the first act of disinformation that happened in the Middle East was 1,500 years ago about who shall inherit the Prophet, Ali or Omar. So we've been living in the act of disinformation for a long time. I think if we tell stories the way we tell them about normal people, I think that will address the issue of disinformation. But look, a lot of the sectarian fighting was created by disinformation. Even before the Russians arrived at the scene, it is as old as storytelling, the process of disinformation, but also weaponizing it at the age of Facebook and Twitter, and people turning to Facebook as if it is a legitimate source of news in the age when newspapers cannot afford to send their journalists. Wallah, I read it on Facebook yesterday that the so-and-so did so-and-so. It becomes an act to which people lose their lives. I mean, a lot of recent events in Syria and Iraq happens in reaction to a post on Facebook. So it's a horrible thing.
Well, I also wonder, because the opposite of that is going and seeing it for yourself and telling the story in complete form, and inspires this thought that Gaza is this one place that is so hard to go do that for journalists. And I wonder what that's like for you as someone who I'm sure if you could, you would be there.
I mean, I think Gaza is the first conflict, at least since the night, I don't know when, where journalists are not allowed to go inside in any form or shape. I mean, you can go as an embed with an Israeli military and then you get censored. The whole conflict is not covered by us journalists. Yes, of course, there are amazing, brave Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Without them, we would be lost. But to ban journalists from getting into a zone, I mean, how is that different from North Korea or anything else?
Hi both. Good morning. I'm Ghaith Abdullah. I don't know what I am. Some people know me as an actor, but it's nice to be in a storytelling festival. I would love you to reflect on the kind of normalizing of mass massacres of Arab bodies and its relationship with Iraq. I don't really know how to formulate this question, but when I imagine the Iraqi experience as it looks at a genocide in Gaza, I imagine a very particular experience in relation to the world, certainly the Western world, but a lot of the world, and how it's willing somehow to accept mass death on this scale. And sometimes it feels like Iraqis are veterans of that experience, and how we look at the world now. And I heard you talk about the lack of accountability for Iraq and how it feeds into this moment that we have now. I'd just invite you to reflect on that, if I may.
I would love to answer this question in Arabic because there is a word in Arabic called ibtidal, which is to make something very cheap, to make it worthless. And this is what struck me when I was during, the worst days of the sectarian fighting in Iraq. The amount of death and bodies, and they become worthless. They're not, of course, but they become, another 50 Iraqis died in a car bomb, or 60, 100. They become such an absurd number. And once I went to this area where there were mass graves for people who were kidnapped and killed. Again, every day we would hear reports in Iraq about 20 people went missing, 15, 30. And then you go to this area where the mass graves are, and like mass graves, just buried under the dirt. And then you realize, oh my God, these are the people who, they're not numbers, they are graves marked by things. The same thing with Gaza. And what I find really unable to comprehend as an Iraqi is when you see, 101 people were killed when they went for an aid distribution center. A whole family wiped out. In Lebanon, when I was there during the war, a whole family, a whole building, 3 stories, 71 people died, killed, because there was one guy who used to be Hezbollah targeted. So the so-called word collateral damage, I hate this word so much, becomes so insignificant because, again, there was no accountability when 10 people died in Iraq. There is no accountability when 200 people are dying now. And this is what breeds so much anger, because what do you think will happen to a people in a city or a young generation when they see all their cousins and uncle dying? And that's what I keep talking about. This trauma in this region grows bigger and bigger from one conflict to another. So I don't know how to answer this question, Khalid, because the idea of numbers, تصبح الأرواح مبتذلة. The people become worthless in the eyes of, outside that conflict.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking about a story you wrote recently in the last year or two about the boat disaster in Mosul, which I think was one of those catastrophes that broke through. And it's a reminder of, I don't want to say that anyone who lives in this society actually becomes numb to these things, but a reminder of how not numb people are. And you described the morgue in Mosul being the only functioning institution because it's just so busy and they have to be. But that even the morgue workers there were shocked by this tragedy.
And this is the sad thing. I mean, Syria today has one of the best rescue units, forces in the universe, because they work so much to bring people from under the rubble. The same thing with the Palestinian Red Crescent, because they've been dealing with this conflict again and again. So, sadly speaking, the morgues and the hospitals in our region is so experienced than anything else.
Yeah.
Andrew?
Andrew North. I used to be a correspondent in Baghdad. Somehow the mention of, when you said talking about the word worthless, it actually brought to mind the protests in Baghdad that started in 2019 and into 2020. And of course, Ghaith, you covered those in detail. For me, one of the memories, and I just wanted you to kind of talk about this, is It's just, 600 young Iraqis were killed in the course of those protests. And it's just amazing that, it's now forgotten so quickly. But I'm just wondering how you think about that moment now and what it represented. Because in some ways, it felt like that was the young generation trying to claim what they had hoped the overthrow of Saddam Hussein could have turned into. And then it's all swept away.
So, Andrew, thank you for bringing that moment, because that is the moment when sectarianism was defeated in Iraq. So sectarianism reached its peak in 2004-05. It was defeated in 2018-19, and it was if we put the sectarian terms to it, these were demonstrations in Baghdad against a corrupt regime. But the strange thing, the amazing thing, it was within this kind of square, Tahrir Square, you see everyone coming together. You see Sunni Shia Kurds, young people. Actually, the word sectarianism is not used ever there. But what's fascinating is you see young Shia, poor, from eastern Baghdad, waving the flags of Imam Hussein, being killed by armed Shia militias, trying to defending this regime installed, strangely speaking, by the Americans. So that was the moment when sectarianism collapsed. It's the moment when both Sunnis and Shia woke up in the morning and said, we don't have electricity, the both of us, so it doesn't matter who's Sunni or Shia. And it's when they realized that the corrupt regime in the green zone, be it Sunni politicians, Christian or Shia, they're all part of this massive corruption in Iraq now, where you have $130 billion a year of oil wealth, and you have streets of Baghdad are some of the poorest and the worst places in the world. So that's the moment. And of course, more than the 600 people killed, you have the thousands who lost their eyes, and because the tear gas was fired straight into the demonstrators. Yes, it is lost. No one remembers that moment, but it created a benchmark in the Iraqi society. A benchmark when everyone talks about Tishreen, the October, about the Tishreen uprising as the moment when sectarianism ended. When you can go to the street, and this happened to me, and listen to people ridiculing militia commanders whose the mere mention of their name would disappear you, would get you kidnapped. They became, and that exposed that regime, exposed the fallacy of, oh, we're defending the Shia. You're killing the Shia. So that is where Tishreen is. Of course, it was lost in the bigger world, because sadly, all uprisings fail. And they fail.
Yeah, maybe we'll end on this glimmer of hope that has been quashed with the heel of reality. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
This episode was recorded in Tbilisi by audio producer Levan Kurtskhalia and audio recorder and editor Zura Patsia. Special thanks to everyone at the Zeg Storytelling Festival for making this possible. The Kicker is a production of the Columbia Journalism Review. Amanda Dara is the producer and editor. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.